Welcome to the channel where today we're venturing into one of the Bible's most unsettling and mysterious stories. We all know about the Nephilim, the giants, who roamed the earth before the flood, shaping history in ways we can barely comprehend. But here's the real question: did they have wives? And if so, who could have possibly dared to marry a Nephilim? What would it have been like to stand beside such colossal beings? Was it even possible for someone to live in their shadow without being swallowed whole by their immense power? These questions are hardly ever asked, yet they stir up more mystery and fascination than anything we've been told in the Sunday sermons. What if there were female giants just as towering and imposing as their male counterparts? Could they have existed? Could these women have been the daughters of giants themselves, or perhaps even the wives of Nephilim? Or could they be part of an entirely separate lineage of female giants? What if these giantesses weren't just the offspring of Nephilim, but an entire unexplored bloodline unto themselves, with their own unique role in human history? As we peel back the layers of this mystery, we'll dig into ancient texts, forgotten lore, and theories that have been ignored for centuries. The truth about these giantesses could change everything we think we know about the giants and their influence on human civilization. Before we jump in, I want to know what you think. Who would dare marry a Nephilim? Could the giantesses truly be their offspring? Or were they a completely separate line of colossal women? Drop a 777 in the comments below, and let's get the conversation started. And a huge thank you to everyone who's supported us through Super. Thanks, your generosity helps keep these deep dives alive, and we're so grateful. Now, let's uncover the shocking truth. Who were the giants' wives? The shocking truth of female giants. Have you ever wondered who the wives of the giants were, and whether the earth once trembled under the footsteps of towering women whose very existence defies everything we thought we knew about ancient history? This is one of the most fiercely debated and tantalizing subjects in all of biblical and historical exploration, a mystery that refuses to be buried beneath time's dusty layers. From scholars poring over sacred texts in candlelit libraries to ordinary souls captivated by the strange stories that echo from humanity's earliest days, countless hearts and minds have wrestled with the enigma of the Nephilim. According to the ancient scriptures, these were no ordinary men. The book of Genesis chapter 6 above unveils a chilling narrative. The sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, whomever they chose. From this forbidden union sprang the Nephilim giants, of fearsome strength and stature beings, whose presence so corrupted the earth that God's heart was grieved. The Apostle Jude later alluded to these same angels, who did not keep their own domain, but abandoned their proper abode, reinforcing the notion of a celestial rebellion that spilled over into human bloodlines. But here is where the shadows grow deeper, and curiosity twists into countless new shapes. Among all these accounts of mighty men, of old men of renown, rises a haunting question: were there giant women as well? Could there have been towering mothers who bore sons that would shake the ground with every stride? And if so, what kind of lives did these giantesses live? Did they weep? Did they rage? Did they dream under the same stars that now look down upon us? It's a question that refuses to fade, precisely because nearly every ancient record, whether preserved within the Bible or whispered through the pages of apocryphal writings, seems to cast giants solely in a masculine mold. Even the mythologies of distant civilizations, from the frost giants of Norse sagas to the titans of Greek lore, overwhelmingly spotlight male figures, leaving the image of female giants almost ghost-like, a tantalizing absence more than a presence. Isn't it strange How so many cultures separated by oceans and centuries seem to agree on this point. And yet might there have been stories left untold, scrolls lost to fire or decay, or memories too fearsome to pass on? Could there have been an entire lineage of giant women whose tales were swallowed by time, leaving only questions behind to haunt our modern minds? If you lived back then, would you have dared look up into the eyes of a woman twice your height, knowing she carried within her veins the mingled essence of heaven's rebels and earth's frailty? This mystery, whether giantesses ever walked beside their colossal husbands, or if the world's stage was reserved only for towering men, continues to mesmerize both seasoned theologians and wide-eyed seekers of forgotten wonders. Perhaps it also serves as a quiet mirror, reminding us that even today, there are vast stories in our own lives that remain hidden, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover them. This haunting silence about giant women, these elusive giantesses, woven into both the sacred scriptures and the old mythologies, is precisely what shrouds the tale of the Nephilim in an even denser fog of mystery. It's almost as if the pages themselves hesitate to speak, leaving curious souls across millennia to peer into a dim corridor where echoes of answers dance just beyond reach. Is the absence of these towering female figures a simple oversight, or does it whisper of truths deliberately veiled for reasons lost to time? Countless seekers, from theologians who pore over ancient manuscripts by lamplight to modern readers of scripture who sit by their bedsides pondering divine riddles, have found themselves grappling with this very question. Could it be that the lack of mention simply reflects a cultural lens, one that framed its grand narratives around masculine heroes and giants as part of a symbolic tapestry meant to convey power, rebellion, or the corruption of flesh? After all, many ancient societies so deeply rooted their identities in patriarchal structures that stories of colossal men would naturally overshadow or even completely exclude their female counterparts. Yet doesn't this eerie quiet also suggest something possibly more profound, might be even unsettling? Could it mean that giantesses never existed at all? That the mingling of the watchers and the daughters of men only ever produced male monstrosities, embodiments of divine transgression, stamped into masculine form? Or is there a darker possibility that tales of these immense women were too disturbing, too potent, and thus purposefully erased from collective memory, lest they overshadow or distort the theological lessons meant to be drawn from the saga of the Nephilim? This uncertainty doesn't just leave a gap in history. It stirs an almost electric curiosity. Can you feel it, that pull to lean closer, as if hoping to catch a whisper from some forgotten elder who still remembers what the scrolls no longer say? Even today, in bustling seminary halls and quiet church pews, or in solitary moments when someone traces their finger over the thin pages of Genesis, these questions bloom again. What was truly unleashed upon the earth when the sons of God descended? Was it only mighty men who roamed in arrogance, or did giant mothers cradle monstrous infants beneath the same stars that watch over us now? Over the centuries, the mystery has given birth to interpretations that sprawl across a vast spectrum, from the cautious voices of conservative scholars who see no need to add to Scripture's silence, to the daring imaginations of others who sketch entire bloodlines of giantesses stalking ancient forests and hidden valleys. Each theory, whether anchored in tradition or soaring on speculative wings, is an attempt to pierce the veil draped over that remote and trembling era of humanity. And maybe this enduring enigma does more than just tease our curiosity. Perhaps it also mirrors something deep within us, that part of every human heart that longs to uncover hidden truths, to piece together the fragments of a story we were never meant to fully grasp. After all, isn't it in our nature to chase after mysteries, even those God might have wrapped in shadows, for reasons only heaven understands? Given the astonishing complexity of this entire subject, it should come as no surprise that we have no absolute answers, no single parchment or fragment of divine speech that conclusively proves whether giantesses once roamed the earth or were merely figments born of human yearning or dread. What we do have are a tapestry of theories and fragile hypotheses, each attempting to illuminate the shadows left behind by ancient narratives and theological speculations that have echoed down through the corridors of time. Isn't it remarkable how thousands of years later, we still stand at the edge of these same questions, hearts pounding with wonder at what might have been? One of the most intriguing approaches to the idea of giantesses traces its roots directly to the foundational story of the Nephilim. Genesis 6 reveals a chilling union of celestial beings, known as the Watchers angels, who fell from their rightful place, mingling with the daughters of men. From this forbidden crossing, giants emerged upon the earth, beings so mighty and so entwined with corruption that God's heart was moved toward judgment. If these sons were giants, could not their daughters have inherited the same fearsome stature? Could towering mothers have one day rocked their equally immense infants beneath sunrises no human today has ever seen? But then deeper questions bubble up. How would such giant women come into being? What roles would they play in the unfolding saga of these hybrid creatures? Would they simply be vessels to continue a monstrous bloodline? Or might they have held positions of power and influence within whatever societies these giants formed? It's almost unsettling to picture them, yet at the same time, it stirs a fascination hard to silence. Perhaps this is why debates continue to rage, inviting everyone from seasoned biblical scholars to casual readers with an appetite for the mysterious to dive ever deeper. To truly appreciate the weight of these debates, we have to look closer at the nature of the Nephilim themselves. One of the most widely discussed interpretations among theologians and students of Scripture is that the Nephilim were not merely men of great size, but hybrid beings living paradoxes born from a union that was never meant to be. This intermingling of species-blending angelic essence with human fragility might explain their extraordinary physical characteristics. In this light, their colossal stature wasn't simply a metaphor, but a literal expression of their otherworldly lineage. More than that, many who embrace this view also argue that these hybrids possessed astonishing longevity. While ordinary humans of that era often lived staggering spans of 500 to 900 years, consider Methuselah, whose life reached an astounding 969 years, or Noah, who walked the earth for 950. The Nephilim might have lived even longer. Can you imagine standing in their shadow, knowing they might witness centuries you and your children would never see? How would it feel to meet eyes with a being who remembered the first planting of vineyards, the rise and fall of countless clans? But longevity, according to some, carried a hidden curse. As these beings continued through the ages, they may have faced a quiet doom, a growing sterility woven into their very biology. Could it be that with each passing century, their capacity to create life dwindled, leaving them as relics destined to vanish once their lengthy days finally expired? This haunting possibility gives rise to a theory that would turn the notion of giantesses on its head. If these creatures were incapable of reproduction, if their line could not stretch beyond the original mingling of watcher and woman, then what purpose would giantesses serve? Without the need to bear future generations, might the existence of female giants be biologically implausible, or at the very least unnecessary in the broader story? And yet here the greatest divide emerges. Was it a matter of natural impossibility that the giants, hybrid and sterile, simply could not produce daughters to stand beside them? Or have the ancient tales, for reasons lost in culture, fear, or divine design, chosen silence on this topic, allowing giantesses to slip quietly through the cracks of recorded history. Isn't it striking how the very absence of their stories continues to provoke more questions than answers? This labyrinth of speculation still winds its way through academic halls and hushed theological gatherings. Scrolls are turned, passages weighed, and minds set ablaze with possibilities. But in the end, no voice has yet offered a truth solid enough to end the debate. Perhaps that's fitting. After all, mysteries like these remind us how vast and unknowable the canvas of creation truly is, and how little we may ever grasp of the extraordinary chapters God has written beyond our sight. There exists a second fascinating perspective about the giants of antiquity, one that pushes back against the long-embedded assumption that only male giants once roamed the earth. This view dares to open a door that many have left firmly shut, that alongside these colossal men, there may very well have walked women of equally immense stature. Could it be that these giantesses were not mythical afterthoughts, but the very partners of the towering beings whose legends thunder through ancient memory? Those who champion this idea often start from a strikingly straightforward point of reasoning. If we accept the proposition that giants truly existed, with bodies stretching anywhere from 3 meters around 9 feet, up to 5 meters over 16 feet, then does it really make sense to imagine them joining themselves to women of average human height, as described in the daily life of ancient societies? Such an extraordinary disparity would not just pose logistical oddities, but biological challenges, calling into question how unions between such mismatched bodies could naturally occur. Isn't it more plausible to consider that these giants might have needed partners who mirrored their formidable scale? This theory gathers even more weight when we look closely at the fabric of societal structures and the way ancient texts, especially the Bible, chose to tell their stories. Throughout the Hebrew scriptures, we see that women, though undeniably vital to the life of their communities, were often given only passing mention in genealogies and historical accounts. Could this selective storytelling, born from deeply patriarchal norms of the ancient Semitic world, be the very reason we hear so little about giant women? In biblical tradition, lineage was meticulously traced through men. Names of fathers and sons were recorded, etched onto scrolls that would be read aloud for generations, preserving the flow of tribal identities and inheritances. Women, by contrast, though they upheld families with the same breath and toil, frequently found themselves noted only briefly or entirely omitted. Consider how the genealogies from Adam to Noah, or from Abraham to David, march forward through sons leaving wives and mothers, largely in the silent background. Isn't it striking that even figures like Sarah, Rebecca, and Rachel, so crucial to God's promises, appear mainly when their stories intersect directly with the men who define the lineage? This focus on male heirs and patriarchal accomplishment did not stop at genealogies. It bled into the grand narratives of triumphs, battles, and judgments, where men's deeds took center stage, while women's contributions were often pushed to the dim edges of memory. Could it be then that if giantesses did exist, their absence in the record is not proof of their non-existence, but rather a testament to the cultural lens that wrote history itself? Under this lens, the idea that giants had female partners becomes more than just a matter of anatomical logic. It emerges as a plausible explanation, shaped by the very patterns of omission common to the ancient world. After all, if towering men strode across valleys and built domains, would it not stand to reason that they shared their lives and possibly their destinies with towering women? Might there have been matriarchs among these colossal beings whose stories were never inscribed, simply because scribes of the time did not deem their legacies central enough to preserve. Imagine just for a breath, standing among such a people. Would you glimpse at the edges of a giant settlement and see immense women drawing water from rivers, teaching colossal children how to weave or plant, or perhaps even offering counsel to their mighty husbands on matters of rule? Could the legends that filtered down to us, clipped and narrowed by patriarchal priorities, have simply failed to carry these images forward? Thus, when modern scholars revisit the biblical accounts that speak of giants, many lean toward this interpretation that the silence on giantesses is not a declaration of their non-existence, but rather a reflection of the cultural biases embedded in the sacred texts. The idea that these enormous men had female partners becomes not only a biological probability, but a reminder of how history, sacred or secular, often leaves entire lives in shadow, simply because it was men who held the pen. And so the mystery persists, urging us to look deeper, to wonder what stories still lie buried beneath centuries of selective remembrance. Going even further into this provocative perspective, the possibility that giantesses truly walked the earth alongside their towering male counterparts, one finds a theory that feels almost inevitable once laid out. If these women of colossal size did exist, it would paint a far more complete portrait of how the Nephilim lineage might have flourished. Rather than seeing the emergence of these giant men as the mere outcome of singular isolated unions between fallen angels and human women, this view suggests something far more structured: a reproductive order that wove together both male and female giants, creating entire generations whose lineages were as complex and intertwined as any royal dynasty, even if history chose not to inscribe their stories. Those who support this notion argue that by acknowledging the likely existence of giantesses, we fill in critical blanks that make the entire saga of the Nephilim not only more plausible, but also more haunting. After all, how could an entire race sustain itself if only giant men existed endlessly pairing with average-sized human women across centuries? Wouldn't it seem more natural, even more necessary, that these gigantic males had partners who shared their vast stature, partners capable of bearing offspring who would inherit the same towering proportions and supernatural traits? Interestingly, this line of reasoning does not rely solely on biblical silences. Advocates often turn their gaze outward, across the great tapestry of global myth. They point to how other civilizations also preserve tales of enormous men and equally formidable women. In Greek mythology, the mighty Titans, colossal beings who once challenged the Olympian gods, didn't stand alone. Many were described as having wives and daughters of comparable majesty, figures like Rhea or Themis, who wielded immense power in their own right. And in the cold reaches of Norse tradition, the frost giants, or Jotnar, were known to include giantesses, whose alliances and feuds played out in tales of cosmic consequence. Could such patterns across diverse cultures suggest that the notion of giant women was part of a shared human instinct to people the world with balanced pairs of extraordinary beings? This comparison across mythologies strengthens the idea that giantesses were not merely an odd speculation, but perhaps a near universal element of humanity's collective imagination. If so, why would the biblical record stand apart in omitting them? Could it be that the omission was intentional, a direct outgrowth of the patriarchal frameworks that dominated the ancient Semitic world? In such societies, descent and inheritance flowed strictly through fathers and sons, weaving a tapestry of genealogies almost exclusively masculine. Isn't it possible that even if giant women existed, they simply did not fit into the narrative priorities of the scribes who preserved these stories? The patriarchal mindset of the time offers a sobering explanation. Throughout Scripture, we see again and again how women, though essential to the continuity of families and even nations, were largely shadowed by the men whose names were written down. Rarely did the roles of ancestry delve into the lives of mothers or sisters unless their stories became unavoidable, as in the case of Ruth or Esther. Could this cultural habit of sidelining female figures have extended even to beings as spectacular as giantesses? If so, then the absence of their mention would be less an argument against their existence and more a reflection of an ancient narrative choice. It would reveal how thoroughly the scriptures mirrored the societal structures of the time structures determined to keep the spotlight firmly fixed on men and their legacies. Does this not hint at an even deeper human tendency to shape history by what we choose to remember and what we quietly allow to fade? Thus, for those who embrace this view, the idea of giantesses becomes not only possible, but essential. They see these towering women as indispensable partners in the perpetuation of the Nephilim race, active participants whose stories were simply never given the ink they deserved. Perhaps they led households of breathtaking scale. Perhaps they stood beside their husbands as councils were held, or wars were planned. Or perhaps they too bore the strange sorrow that comes with being the offspring of heaven's rebellion and earth's frailty. In the end, this theory does more than propose an alternative biological model. It underscores how our ancient records were shaped by the hands and minds of men who had very particular ideas about what mattered most. And in doing so, it invites us to wonder how many other stories equally astonishing have been lost to the silent corridors of time, simply because no one thought them worth writing down. There is yet a third perspective on the giants of old, a view that, while sharing some roots with the earlier notion of hybrid sterility, branches into fascinating new territory that begs for deeper exploration. According to this theory, giants were not merely towering anomalies in the human story. They were inherently sterile beings who, by the very nature of their mixed lineage, stood outside the ordinary cycles of birth and legacy. And while this echoes the first concept, we examined it, layers on nuances that give the ancient mystery even darker hues. Those who lean into this interpretation often point first to the extraordinary lifespans attributed to early humanity in the scriptures. The genealogies of Genesis are dotted with staggering ages. Adam lived 930 years, Noah reached 950, and Methuselah's days stretched to an almost unimaginable 969. If ordinary men of those ages could touch the brink of a millennium, then what might we expect of creatures whose veins ran thick with a mingling of heaven's rebellious essence and earth's fragile dust? Could these giants born of fallen angels and human women have walked the world for spans even longer, outlasting entire kingdoms and the rise and fall of countless families? From this vantage, the giants would stand as living monuments, towering testaments to a forbidden union who needed no heirs to ensure their tale endured. If you could wander the earth for 1,000 years or more, would you feel any urgency to raise children to carry your name? Or would your own existence stretched across ages be enough to carve your story deep into the memory of the world? This line of thought helps explain one of the thorniest riddles of the biblical record: why there is so little mention of female giants or giantesses who might have borne offspring. Perhaps in stark contrast to human needs, these hybrid beings simply had no necessity for procreation. Their extended lifespans would have allowed them to witness generation after generation of ordinary men rise, struggle, and return to dust, all while they themselves continued largely unchanged. Their legend sustained not by descendants, but by the sheer length of their days. In this way, the giants are cast almost as immortals, or at least as creatures whose longevity made them feel nearly so. Even without children to follow in their immense footsteps, they could linger across epochs, shaping the fears and stories of countless human communities. Can you imagine living in a small village, overshadowed by rumors that somewhere beyond the hills, a giant still paced old beyond reckoning, watching as your ancestors lived and died, as your own children were born, and as your line passed into history, all while he endured unchanged? But this perspective also draws attention to a curious and haunting problem. In the biblical narrative, the giants reappears after the flood. In theory, that cataclysmic deluge was meant to wipe clean the slate of humanity, sparing only Noah and his family. How then could giants whose existence provoked divine grief in the first place have emerged once more upon the earth? Doesn't that raise unsettling questions about the limits of judgment and the persistence of forbidden bloodlines? Many scholars who hold this view suggest a provocative solution. They propose that the Watchers, the same fallen angels who descended in the days before the flood, returned yet again, seduced once more by the daughters of men. Despite the divine wrath that had already visited the earth, these celestial rebels may have dared to breach the boundaries of heaven and earth a second time, sowing fresh seeds of corruption. Could this explain the presence of formidable figures like the Anakim and the Rephaim, who haunted the land of Canaan in stories that caused even hardened warriors to tremble? This notion finds subtle support in scriptures that hint at the ongoing defiance of these angelic beings. The book of Jude warns of angels who abandoned their proper dwelling, and 2 Peter speaks of those who sinned and were cast into gloomy dungeons. Yet some interpretations leave open the haunting possibility that not all were fully restrained, that breaches continued in ways too mysterious or too terrifying for the human pen to capture in detail. And so under this theory, the giants did not need sons or daughters to carry on their kind. Their lives stretched so long that they themselves became living chronicles, whispering of a defiance that would not die even beneath the weight of divine floodwaters. In their continued presence after judgment, we glimpse not just an ancient biological curiosity, but perhaps a spiritual lesson as well, that corruption once welcomed may prove staggeringly hard to fully eradicate, and that sometimes the consequences of trespass echo on not through children, but through unnatural lives that linger far beyond their appointed time. Yet even with this mysterious return of the giants after the flood, even with their renewed tread upon the earth and the echoes of dread they cast across human hearts, their story did not continue unchecked. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, at first, a decline began to take hold. The giants, though still formidable and cloaked in the fear of entire nations, started to appear less frequently across the annals of history. Their mighty figures became rare sights on battlefields, and their dominion over the imaginations of men began to wane. Was it simply the hand of time, or did the divine will tighten ever more firmly around these remnants of a forbidden union? The scriptures give us glimpses of this gradual fading. In Genesis 14, we find one of the earliest recorded confrontations between humankind and these towering beings. There, an alliance of 5 kings marshaled their armies to wage war against 3 distinct races of giants. Can you picture it? The clash of swords and the tremor of the earth beneath the march of thousands human warriors, daring to lift their spears against beings who once seemed untouchable. And according to the account, the giants fell. The coalition of kings prevailed, striking a blow that would resonate far beyond their own kingdoms. This episode is not merely a footnote in the chronicles of ancient warfare. It is a striking testament to the vulnerability of the giants, that even these towering hybrids could be humbled by determined mortals. This trend did not stop there. As the centuries rolled on, the biblical narrative continues to show the giants not as unconquerable forces, but increasingly as adversaries who could be overcome. Nowhere is this shift more vividly captured than in the beloved yet harrowing story of David and Goliath. In this passage from 1 Samuel 17, the Israelites stand paralyzed by fear as Goliath, a champion of the Philistines, towering more than 3 meters high, issues his daily challenge. The sheer presence of this giant sends seasoned soldiers into retreat. But then into this tense tableau steps David, a young shepherd boy, whose faith in the living God burns brighter than the fear that grips his compatriots. When David slays Goliath with a single stone, it is not merely a triumph of cleverness over brute force, nor just the personal vindication of a humble shepherd who refused Saul's armor. It is a profound symbol, almost a divine pronouncement, that the age of giants was drawing to a close. Does it not stir something within you to imagine standing there among the Israelite ranks, watching as this colossal warrior crashes to the ground, his fall signaling not just his own end, but the dimming of a race that had once haunted humanity with terror and awe? Goliath's death stands as the culmination of countless skirmishes between mankind and these towering offspring of heaven's rebellion. Though he may have been revered and feared in his time, his story reveals that giants were no longer the indomitable forces they might once have seemed. They could be challenged, they could be brought low, and each defeat pushed their kind a step closer to the margins of history. Is it not compelling to consider that these accounts, from the coalition of kings toppling giant clans to the lone shepherd boy felling the last great champion together, chart the slow, inevitable unraveling of a line that began in celestial defiance? Perhaps it is also a subtle lesson for us today. No matter how mighty or entrenched a power might appear, there comes a moment when courage, conviction, or divine justice rises to meet it, and the giants of our own age, whether literal or symbolic, must eventually bow. Although the towering presence of giants slowly receded from the stage of human history, it is striking, even essential, to recognize that across many ancient cultures, these beings continued to loom large in memory and myth. They were not always cast as monstrous threats. In many traditions, giants occupied a place of awe, sometimes even reverence. Can you imagine living in a time when stories of colossal figures were more than bedtime fancies, but deeply woven into the very way your people understood the universe and their fragile place within it? In these mythologies, the giants often transcended the narrow bounds of mere physical might. They were described as creatures endowed with extraordinary abilities, capable of deeds so marvelous or terrifying they blurred the line between hero and god. Their hands might carve mountains, their feet open valleys. Such narratives do more than simply entertain. They reveal a profound psychological truth about humanity's need to grapple with forces far beyond its control. Isn't it fascinating that so many distant civilizations, separated by vast seas and centuries, all gave rise to stories of beings whose power seemed to exceed anything the mortal heart could comfortably hold? For these ancient societies, giants frequently stood not only as figures of fear, but also as symbols of immense respect. Their grandeur inspired a reverent awe, as though they occupied some twilight realm, halfway between earth and heaven. Encounters between humans and giants, when these stories were told, were often suffused with a charged atmosphere, a fragile mixture of terror, wonder, and an aching sense of destiny. Who wouldn't tremble standing in the shadow of a creature whose gaze seemed to pierce beyond time itself? Consider the Greeks, whose rich tapestries of myth include the Titanomachy, that cataclysmic war where the Olympian gods rose up against the elder Titans, a race of giants who once held dominion over the cosmos. This was more than a mere tale of combat. It was a meditation on succession, on the terrifying necessity of new powers overthrowing the old. How many listeners huddled around ancient fires wondered what it would mean for their own generation to face the giants of the past. The biblical tradition, too, presents a relationship between humankind and these extraordinary beings that is steeped in ambiguity. The giants described in Genesis, the Nephilim born of the sons of God, and the daughters of men, are figures of both majesty and menace. Their existence points to a mingling of the human with something other, a collision of earthly life with a higher, perhaps fallen power. Isn't it telling how the very idea of these unions stirs both dread and dark fascination in the hearts of those who read these ancient words even today? As time rolled on, however, the giants' place in the chronicles of nations began to wane. Their once dominant stature in collective memory softened, retreating from daily experience into the hazier realms of folklore and whispered legend. This disappearance was not abrupt. Like the slow fading of stars at dawn, their presence dwindled gradually, signaling the close of an age where men measured themselves against creatures who seemed to stride effortlessly between the mortal and the divine. Yet even as their physical forms passed into shadow, the giants left indelible marks upon the cultures that once lived beneath their towering myths. The stories lingered carved into temple walls, sung by poets, and etched into the sacred texts that continue to shape spiritual imaginations today. Perhaps this enduring memory says as much about us as it does about them, that humanity has always sensed forces far greater than itself. And in telling tales of giants, we find a way to face those vast, unknowable powers, trembling but unbroken. The successive defeats of the giants, along with the gradual fading of the lineages that some traditions claim were once populated by these towering beings, signal far more than the mere passing of a race. They mark the close of an entire epoch, the end of a mysterious chapter where giants were not only physical forces but profound symbols of power that seemed to hover at the very edge of the human world. As this old order receded, it paved the way for the advancement of human civilizations, which over countless generations slowly extended their reach across lands once rumored to echo with the thunderous steps of colossal creatures. Isn't it astonishing to imagine that what was once a realm dominated by beings larger and perhaps older than any human dynasty eventually came under the dominion of fragile, short-lived mortals? This decline of the giants serves as more than a simple historical footnote. It becomes a metaphor for humanity's slow but relentless rise. Once giants stood as emblems of absolute strength, embodiments of a terrifying, almost cosmic authority. Yet over time, they were pushed either into oblivion or reshaped into mythological fragments, half remembered in fireside tales and sacred scrolls. Their diminishing presence reveals a subtle truth that even the mightiest forces can be eroded by the persistent march of human courage and ingenuity. But this fading grandeur does not imply that giants were ever invincible. Far from it. The very stories that chronicle their mighty deeds and fearsome stature, like those found within the pages of the Bible, also unflinchingly portray their defeats. Consider the unforgettable encounter between David and Goliath. Here was a giant towering over men and armored to intimidate even the bravest. And yet he fell to a simple sling and a shepherd boy's unwavering faith. Could any tale more powerfully illustrate that true strength often lies hidden in what the world dismisses as weak giants, regardless of their size, and might prove not to be unbeatable? Many scholars see these epic confrontations as layered narratives, not merely accounts of muscle versus muscle, but symbolic struggles, casting the forces of good against the forces of corruption. The downfall of giants and the corresponding rise of human heroes capture something timeless. The victory of human virtues, especially faith, resilience, and moral courage against overwhelming odds. Doesn't it stir the heart to think that the triumph of a single steadfast spirit could stand as the undoing of an entire monstrous lineage? This rich historical and cultural backdrop also invites us to look closer at one of the most intriguing and still shadowed aspects of these ancient tales: the mysterious question of the giants' interactions with women. Scattered legends whisper of giants who at some point took human women as partners, spawning hybrid descendants whose blood carried both the spark of heaven's rebellion and the frailty of mortal flesh. These unions, whether real or merely the fearful imaginings of old storytellers, only deepen the enigma. Yet when we search the records, whether sacred texts or age-old epics, we find an almost eerie silence surrounding the concept of giantesses. So many narratives focus on male giants, detailing their battles, boasts, and ultimate downfalls, while offering little more than empty space where their female counterparts might have stood. Isn't it curious how frequently these stories omit any mention of towering mothers or sisters, as though a deliberate hand had swept them from the parchment? Many have interpreted this absence as yet another reflection of the patriarchal framework that dominated ancient societies. In a world where even mortal women were often silenced in the genealogies and epic songs, how much less likely was it for female giants to be granted a place of prominence in the chronicles? Could it be that giantesses did indeed walk the earth, their stories simply deemed unworthy of recording by scribes whose eyes were fixed solely on male feats and lineages? But then we must ask, does the absence of giantesses in these ancient texts truly prove they never existed? Or is it more telling of a cultural lens that chose what was worthy of remembrance and what could be quietly allowed to vanish? The uncomfortable truth is that without direct evidence or explicit testimony, we cannot decisively proclaim that giantesses never drew breath in the world's early mists. Perhaps the real question is not whether they existed, but why so many voices across time chose not to tell their stories. And doesn't that silence, in its own haunting way, speak volumes to truly arrive at deeper, more meaningful conclusions about this haunting subject? We would need a far broader investigation than most have ever undertaken, and one that stretches beyond simply poring over the fragile lines of Scripture. Such a study would call for a sweeping exploration that also dives into the intricate weave of cultural norms, social dynamics, and historical contexts that shaped and molded these ancient narratives. Isn't it fascinating to consider how the very way people recorded their world, what they chose to elevate, and what they quietly pushed to the margins, was deeply influenced by forces far beyond mere theology? The questions that circle around the existence of giantesses, or even the tantalizing possibility of entire societies of giants composed of both towering men and equally formidable women, continue to ripple through scholarly circles. Theologians, historians, and passionate enthusiasts of ancient mysteries each approach these riddles with their own lanterns of interpretation, hoping to illuminate dark corners that have resisted clarity for thousands of years. Some scholars, gazing at the scant but suggestive hints scattered through ancient writings, dare to propose that the relationship between giants and humankind was far more nuanced than the stark tales of direct conflict so often told. Could it be that beyond the battlefield clashes and the heroic slayings we like to celebrate, there were moments of uneasy coexistence, perhaps even cooperation? Might there have been trade treaties or shared rituals that have been entirely lost to us, swallowed by time's relentless hunger? If so, what stories of blended communities, of whispered alliances, or forbidden loves lie forever beyond our reach? These possibilities stretch even further when we entertain the idea of mixed lineages. Many traditions, not just the biblical accounts, suggest that the union between giants or their divine progenitors and human women produced hybrid offspring. Genesis Eos is perhaps the most arresting biblical example, with its haunting account of the sons of God, who looked upon the daughters of men and took them as wives, resulting in the Nephilim. But look beyond Israel's borders, and you find strikingly similar threads in countless other mythologies, tales from Mesopotamia, Greece, and even the distant reaches of Norse legend speak of gods or heavenly beings descending to mingle their fates with mortals. Could so many disparate cultures have all simply imagined the same stories? Or does this common thread hint at a deeper, perhaps universal human memory or fear? Other thinkers lean heavily on the idea of giants as hybrids themselves, their very existence testifying to a boundary crossed that should never have been breached. In this view, these beings stand as living paradoxes, part divine, part earthbound, never fully at home in either realm. Might their imposing size and frightening power have masked a deeper tragedy, that they were forever torn between two natures, never entirely belonging to heaven or to earth? And how would it feel if you were one of them, to stride across the world knowing you bore in your veins a mingling that many saw as an abomination? This proposal that giants were the product of divine beings uniting with mortals finds echoes in more places than we often acknowledge. Greek myths speak of heroes born from gods and humans, like Hercules, whose might was unparalleled, but whose life was shadowed by torment. In Sumerian stories, demigods straddled the line between earthly kings and heavenly mandates. Even among the old Germanic tribes, legends told of supernatural unions that yielded extraordinary children. Isn't it intriguing how again and again, civilizations separated by vast oceans and towering mountain ranges arrived at eerily similar ideas? And so with each theory, the tapestry grows more intricate. Whether envisioning giants as ancient oppressors to be overthrown, as tragic hybrids doomed by their very blood, or as mysterious participants in societies far more complex than we might ever fully grasp, one thing remains constant: their stories refuse to lie dormant. They reach across millennia to stir something deep within us, perhaps a recognition that humanity has always sought to explain its fears and its wonders by imagining beings larger than life, whose struggles mirror our own in monstrous, exaggerated form. In the end, maybe it is not definitive proof we are meant to find, but rather the profound questions themselves, questions that draw us back to ancient firesides and starlit deserts, wondering what other stories might still whisper to those willing to lean in close enough to hear. When we step back and trace the shadowy footprints of these ancient giants, whether towering men alone or perhaps alongside silent, unrecorded giantesses, we find ourselves drawn into a story far larger than the sum of their bones or battles. These myths, these fragments of scripture and legend, do more than tease us with questions about colossal beings who may have once roamed the earth. They speak to something timeless within the human spirit, our yearning to understand power, destiny, and the delicate dance between what is seen and what lies forever hidden. Perhaps the real lesson woven through these accounts is that even the mightiest must one day bow. Giants fell not only to the blades of kings or the stones of shepherds, but to the unstoppable passage of time and the quiet resilience of humanity. Isn't there something incredibly hopeful in that? That, in a world still filled with towering problems and dark unknowns, it is often humble virtues, faith, courage, the will to stand firm that carry the day. It makes me wonder, what are the giants in your own life right now? Are they fears, failures, impossible dreams you've locked away because they seem too vast to tackle? Or maybe they're burdens passed down from generations before, like hidden stories that still shape your path. Remember that the giants of old, no matter how fearsome, eventually gave way. So too can the struggles you face. Sometimes the smallest acts of bravery or a single step of faith is all it takes to start toppling what once seemed immovable. Personally, reflecting on these ancient mysteries humbles me. It reminds me that we are all part of a much grander tapestry, one threaded with triumphs and questions that stretch back to the dawn of our world. And if the past teaches us anything, it's that even stories that vanish from written record still echo quietly in hearts willing to listen. If this journey through forgotten legends and hidden truths has stirred something inside you, I invite you to stay with us on this channel. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments. Tell me, do you think giantesses ever walked this earth, or were they lost to time by the hands of scribes who could not see their worth? And if you'd like to bless this work further, you can always support us through Super Thanks. Every gift, every kind word helps keep these stories alive. Thank you for being here, for sharing your time and wonder. May God bless you richly. May He give you the strength to face every giant in your life, knowing that even the greatest must one day fall.